Cool. So yeah, I am Conlin. I am a software engineer at Lessonly. So this talk is all about JSX, kind of what it is, how it works, and why I kind of personally think it is one of the most underrated parts of the entirety of React. So like I said, I'm a software engineer. I primarily focus on the front end. So I work a lot with JSX. I really like the syntax. I think it's a really interesting way to kind of build UIs, even just outside of the kind of React ecosystem. So what is JSX? Does anybody have a definition that they'd like to just yell out loudly? You don't have to. All right, cool.
Syntax library on top of JavaScript that allows you to write code as if it's HTML like markup. Cool.
So a syntax part of on top of JavaScript that lets you write markup like HTML but in JavaScript. Cool. That's a great answer. So I think the best way to understand JSX is to look at what was before JSX, kind of see the natural transition from HTML and the DOM, or the document object model, to JSX. So we start with an HTML file, right? This does not look a whole lot like JavaScript, but I hope you all will see in a minute that this is essentially just a JSON tree. It's the document object model, and JSON is a JavaScript object notation. So they both involve representing things as objects. But if we were to show this, you can see this is my OK site. If we go back here, however, we can start to think of this represented as a JSON tree, right? It has an element, like the HTML tag. That element has properties and then children. And it becomes this tree of objects with those three properties. And as programmers will know, these can easily be abstracted into a function of some kind. So if we look at that, we start to see this is not the whole thing. This is just specifically the header and h1 part of it. But we have this CreateElement function. CreateElement takes the name here. It takes some properties, like a class, and then some children in an array. And this is basically what JSX is. At compile time, when you're running it through Babel or through a React processor or anything, it's converting those HTML tag syntax into functions that are being called. And I can show you what this looks like. So you say this. We're going to go ahead and just load that JavaScript file. Now, my OK site is not running. 1 second. Now my OK site is running. And now it's my rad site, because that's all being loaded through JavaScript. So as you can see, that replaced everything that was in the ID app. That's pretty simple. That's just happening here. We set the inner HTML to nothing, and then append this child that's being created by these CreateElement things. But that's not a fun thing to write. That's a lot of syntax. It would be a lot cooler if we could just make that look like HTML, since that's what it's generating anyway. It's not open. There we go. So we can do that. There is a Babel plugin called React Transform JSX, I believe, that basically just pulls the transformation of JSX out of the React Babel work and just gives it its own package. And you can use this defining things like this. So if we take this, and we add it here, that tells that renderer that we now want to use this function, CreateElement, anytime that we see JSX. So now we take this very simple JSX function. It makes a component. Now, it's all broken. I don't know why. Oh, I had this saved. I do have this saved. This is my bad. So we need to put that into a page. And then instead of rendering header down here, we're going to render page. And there it is. So now it's my cool site. And as you can see, that is putting some HTML in here. There's a header. There's my class, my cool header, and then my h1. And so what that's doing here is that's converting this syntax into the same thing that we were getting when we were just calling the function. So we look at that function, it does a couple things. It takes element, which is just a string or a function in the case of a custom component. It takes props, which are just all the properties, and then it takes children. And children is anything that comes the way that the JSX function works. It just calls all the things that should be rendered underneath it as the last arguments to this after the first two. So we just use this red syntax, we get everything that comes after this, and we have an array of children. Then it gets pretty easy. We check if the element is of a type string. If it is, that means that it is a just standard HTML element, like a div or an h1 or something like that. JSX knows what those are and turns them as strings. So then we call document.createElement, which is a JavaScript API. With that element name, it creates a new fragment that has an h1 in it, for instance. If there are props, we then map the props to the element. So we pass in that document element that we just made. We call this function here. This only special thing here is that in JavaScript, the class keyword is reserved. And so you cannot put class as an object key in an object. So you have to use class name, which is why in React, anytime you write a thing, it takes class name and not class, because that keyword is reserved. Also, I should mention, if there's any questions at any point, I'd love to answer them. Just raise your hand or shout them out. So if we do have this prop key named class name, we add a class list to this element with that value. Otherwise, we just call set attribute with that property key and the rest of the information. So if we were to have an ID property, we would get in here. We would see, okay, the key is not class name. So we will just set the attribute of the element with the key ID to be the value of whatever we pass in, since props is just an object. And then we do the same thing, and we do it with children. So we map the document element and the children, we go over them. There's a little bit more of a consideration here. There's this is element check. Basically, we just have to see if the thing that's underneath it is an HTML element. If it is an HTML element, we want to just append it as a normal child, as you would in JavaScript. And then if it's not, and it's a string and a text node of some kind, we want to just create a new text node with this document create text node, and then append that, because that creates the HTML equivalent of just a blank string. Otherwise, if the array, or if the children is an array, meaning that it has multiple children underneath it, we do the same thing, except we just map over each one of the children and call the function again, so it gets recursive. So what that means is now we have defined how it handles a normal HTML element like an h1 or a header. But in React, as you know, we have custom components. You can write a component just like we did here. And this is just a function. It's a functional component that takes a class name and some children, just like you would in React, and then returns this header with those children, and then we call it like this. The JSX library knows that this header is a function. It can recognize that we have defined that here as a function. And so in this utils, we check if the type of element is function. Then it gets real easy, and we just get to call it with element, props, and children. and then return it. We don't have to append it, we don't have to do anything with that because that function is then defining whatever it does. React has a lot of other considerations in their react.createElement function, which is essentially this function, but with all of React's considerations in there. They run all of the virtual DOM, all of the different like dipping algorithms and things to essentially determine if what you're passing in now has changed, and also to do a bunch of like work with fibers and a lot of other stuff. But for the most part, this is the same function that React runs internally whenever you call JSX. So that's pretty cool. Are there any questions about that? All right, sweet. So now that we kind of know how this createElement function works, let's go ahead and look at some of the other cool things we can do with it. So this is kind of an odd example. This doesn't look a whole lot like JavaScript. This looks a lot like XML, which is terrifying for some people. But we're going to go ahead and copy this in here. That's not right. Sorry, I have Prettier running. I think it's a little weird. Okay, so we've imported those. Now let's see what that did. It got rid of the stuff because we don't have the header anymore. But instead, now you'll notice there's just an empty div in our HTML tree. But if we go into the console, you'll see this cool little table here. Now the thing is, because JSX is just running a function, right? We talked about in that in here, if the type of element is a function, we just call that function with those props and children that we've passed in. And so what we've actually done here is we have this integer class component, I guess, that just takes a property called num and returns it. And then what we can also do is we have this sort class that is, or sorry, sort component. I'm going to do that all night. It just takes its children and then calls it with bubble sort. And so because of the way that children are defined, it loops them into an array, passes them into this function as children. And so we actually end up, because of the structure here, we end up with this creates an array of these integers and then passes them into a bubble sort function. And then we have this console table log. This is just like a console log, but it makes a nice looking table. And you'll see it just takes its children and then logs them. And so because sort just returns a bubble sorted array, we end up with this getting an array as its children. It then just console tables its children. And we get this nice little table in here. So that's a complete separation from the original idea of like rendering HTML to the page. And instead now we have this really interesting way of calling functions, right? Some of you, if you've been in like the functional programming world or in Python or some other languages, will know that a lot of other languages have positional arguments and named arguments. And JSX gives us a way to bring some of those qualities to JavaScript. And so we actually have these like keyword arguments here now of num that is getting called on this function. And that gets to the very, very weird part of this talk, where we start to do some stuff that you should never do in actual code. You probably shouldn't do this in actual code, because this is not a great idea. But what we're about to talk about is an even more interesting, oh, one more thing, actually, this was just for fun. So if we go here, I just had to show off this little function. If anybody built like GeoCity sites back in the day, this was always a fun little thing you could do where you set the cursor to make something cool like that. And so this is just another example of calling a function that has nothing to do with rendered HTML with JSX. So this doesn't take any arguments. It doesn't do anything fancy. I forgot about this, actually. I was going to show it before the table thing. But this just does a whole lot of work to build out that batify, bat flying everywhere cursor thing. But as you can see, it doesn't return anything. It doesn't have any, it has a giant data URL. But at the end, there's nothing returned from this function. It doesn't handle returning more HTML or doing anything else. So it's not exactly a component in the way that we would think of it. It's more of a function that has been called differently. I'm not going to show this one, but this does a lot of the same thing. It creates a canvas element, which then we can call declaratively. I'll show this real quick. This is kind of neat. So if anybody's ever used the Canvas API, you know it can get kind of cumbersome with like calling context and like draw a rectangle and remembering the order of everything. I always forget the order if it's like X, Y, height, width, or whatever. So the nice thing about this is if we define a canvas, we can then do a fill rect X equals 0, y equals 0, height equals 10, maybe, width equals 10. We'll give it a color of red. So now, somewhere, you should get, something isn't loading. I'm not sure what it is. Oh, I know what it is. Okay, well, something's still not loading. Regardless, when this works, I'm not going to spend too long on this because it's not that interesting. The nice thing is you get these really easy ways to not have to worry about the order that you call your arguments in, which is something that we often have to do in JavaScript, right? Because what's happening here is this is just taking them in as an object and then returning them as this function that gets called. It gets passed in with a CTX from here. There's some just really cool stuff that's happening. I don't know why it's broken, but as you can see, like this returns a canvas element so that we actually render that to the HTML. But then fill rect doesn't actually do anything with that canvas element or with HTML or JSX. Instead, it just calls this function, which has these very like positionally dictated arguments, but you could put them in the JSX in any order. So now is when we're going to get weird. And we're going to do something, like I said, that you should never do. We are going to call our JSX function with a really, really weird syntax here. So you can see that that is a function that takes A and B, curries the eval of A with the arguments to B, which is very strange. But what it means we can do is this. So now if we look in the console, you'll see we've console logged this 15. What's really strange here is we find this eval curry function up here with this reducing function, which is essentially like array.reduce, except it takes an array as a positional argument, initial, all of these things, and a function. You can see this function call with reduce is now a JSX call with that function passed in, and these positional arguments as array, initial, func, all of that interesting stuff. So by redefining our JSX evaluator function to be this strange A, comma B, eval A with B kind of thing, what that does is, if you remember, that first argument to whatever create element function you pass in is the function that corresponds to that component, right? So in this case, our component is this reduce function, which just takes an object, and then all of the other arguments are just the props to that argument. We're not using children here, obviously. But instead now, we just pass in all of the arguments in here. So what we then can do is if we take this, I gotta figure out, okay. Yeah. So now we have this strange curry syntax, which takes a function and then some arguments and then the additional arguments. If you know anything about functional programming, this is just a way that you don't have to pass in all of the arguments to a thing. And then we have the same reduce function, but now we have this sum function, which is a partially applied reduce given an initial and then a function that just adds the things together. And then we can call sum as a JSX with a keyword argument curried function here. And we console log that. You'll see we also get 15 here. And so there's this really interesting, like, we are basically breaking the JSX syntax and what it does by understanding how it works to create something that has never existed in JavaScript before, which is this idea of like partially applied keyword arguments. Keyword arguments don't really exist in JavaScript at all. And so that's pretty much all I have talk-wise. If there are any questions, I would love to hear them. I think there was one, I don't remember what it was, 1 second. If anybody has one that they want to just shout out, I'm just going to pull up we had a couple from Slack. Just to open on that screen. Are there any questions? Yeah.
I have what might end up being a stupid one, but a couple times you kept talking about how you shouldn't do this in production, you shouldn't do this really. I mean, this whole idea of actually being able to introduce keyword arguments seems really nice. What's the downside? Why shouldn't we be doing this?
The biggest reason is that the eval keyword is really bad in JavaScript. It's going to slow down your execution a lot. You're going to introduce a lot of performance errors and issues, some security things. I think it's more interesting, less from it, like having the keyword arguments in JavaScript, and more just what we start to get when we think about JSX as a language in and of itself. It's not just a clone of HTML or just a HTML dropped into JS, which is what everybody thought it was when it started out. Which is why people hated it, was because they looked at it and they were like, why would you want to do this? This is just HTML and JavaScript. But as it stands right now, you end up with this really cool like syntax of doing these really neat things. And I'm not 100% sure, actually. I want to see if I can find my cursor. Where did we go? Hey, there it is. I didn't actually check this, but I believe what? Yeah, so you'll see here there's like evals dropped in the code. I'll make that bigger. So I don't know if you can see that, but these are evals, right? and so they are going to cause like performance issues, and eval, or like the function statement in JavaScript, is kind of broken. Like you really shouldn't use it. But I think that the mindset of like thinking about this from this standpoint is kind of interesting. I will say Webpack, I think, does use some like evals and stuff to like render strings and like load strings, but it just gets a little strange when you're doing it yourself. You never know what security issues you're going to drop in.
So I have a couple of things that kind of tie into each other. Writing JSX in this manner, if you're in a React code base, it's going to complain if you write JSX for just regular old functions. If they're lowercase, it's going to think it's supposed to be an HTML. And then the thing that kind of ties into is I'm not sure that I necessarily think that using JSX as kind of an alternative to, I guess, the vanilla JS way of writing a function is necessarily something that would be great to see. One of the great benefits of JSX in React code is that it helps you to read React code more like you would read the DOM typically if you look at the Elements tab. So it enhances readability. When it's over-abstracted, what I feel like it's over-abstracted is in cases like these. And I know that you're just showing like some of the cool things it can do. I just don't necessarily think this is like the future of JavaScript.
Sure, yeah. I'll summarize. I didn't summarize yours, I'm sorry, I should have. Just because I think we're recording, so I'm not sure if it'll pick up. But essentially, your JSX is really tied to React and works very well as a representation of these DOM elements in React. You're not sure if the carryover happens to vanilla JavaScript.
Yeah, so it helps when developing UI. So Vue also allows you to use JSX.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if Angular has any concept of that yet, or if they ever will. But yeah, it's very helpful in UI development. I can't see this being something where like a Node.js developer is going to be writing their API in JSX.
So that's a very good point. And I almost had an example of this in here. The one place that I think it could be interesting in Node especially is when building console UIs in like Node scripts. So if you were going to write like a command line tool that you wanted to show like some dashboard or something, but from the command line. I don't know how many other people do that. I like to mess around with command line stuff every now and then and just have fun things. But it is an opportunity there by defining your own functions with JSX and giving that JSX pragma at the top. You can actually like render to like the blessed library, the things that you're calling as JSX, and define them in the same way you define like an HTML page. So I guess I agree. Like it's basically the same thing, right? Like it's a UI that you are using this to render, and I don't think that there's any. Especially the curry and like all of that stuff, it's mostly just interesting. I think it helps to kind of understand how JSX works, but I agree. I don't think you should ever really use JSX for anything other than like rendering a view. But another good example of this, and this is where it's actually used too, is like in React Native. And React Native doesn't render HTML objects. They have defined their own React CreateElement equivalent that renders like an XML document for an Android app, or like I don't know what the equivalent is in like Swift or iOS, but it's a similar idea, right? Like they're using the React engine and this Vue templating language that is almost a full language in and of itself, given that you can set like a pragma to render mobile UIs that are native.
I threw this out too. There's a DOM output called ink, I think, that I just uses that does exactly what you're saying, where it takes JSX and renders it as
Yeah, you said it was ink?
Yeah.
Okay, so that was just that there's a library that does that, where you take a JSX thing and renders it as a console UI. That's really cool. There was another thing I was gonna. The other reason that you might want to do this at some point is that you can actually use like the JSX pragma with libraries. I can't see my. There we go. Like HTML. Which is a hyperscript tag markup. It is a tag syntax for template strings in JavaScript that allow you to do JSX style things, but using template languages. So you can actually use JSX, that JSX pragma to set HTML as like the library that it uses to render JSX instead of the internal React library, which is another cool option where if you want to not use React, if you wanted to switch out your React renderer from that to HTML or like use it for something else. There are some interesting use cases around that kind of thing. So it does a lot of different things with like optional quotes and these really interesting like tags and in tags and some really odd stuff, but it's kind of cool. Any other questions? Cool. I think it's 7:30, so hit it right on the mark. I don't know. Do you have anything else, Amber? Are we good?
Not really.
All right. Cool. I'd love to talk to anybody after about anything. I really like talking about JavaScript. I really like talking about this whole JSX thing. So if you have any questions that you didn't want to ask, please come up and ask them or find me, and I'll hang out for the whole time, and then I'll probably go after if there's people going to the bar or something. Cool.